"You will not speak over me again." Those words, delivered with calm precision by Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, froze the entire House Judiciary Committee hearing room. Moments earlier, few would have guessed that the usually unflappable Stephen Miller, the former Trump advisor often described as the chief architect of the administration's immigration crackdown, would find himself at a loss for words. But within half an hour, Crockett's unshakable presence transformed the hearing into one of the most talked about political confrontations of the year. On that Tuesday afternoon, the committee chamber was so crowded that not a single seat remained empty. Journalists jostled for space, staffers leaned forward with pens ready, and observers whispered among themselves, anticipating fireworks. At the witness table sat Miller, his jaw set, his piercing stare locked on the panel. Across from him, Crockett adjusted her microphone, steady but unyielding. What unfolded next was not just another exchange in Washington, it was a clash of personalities, legacies, and visions for America. Miller, just 38, had spent his career shaping some of the Trump administration's most controversial immigration measures. The family separation policy at the border, the travel ban on several Muslim-majority countries, and a broader agenda that sought to deter migrants through harsh enforcement. Known for his combative demeanor, Miller had made a reputation in D.C. as someone who could dominate any discussion through rapid-fire talking points and an unwavering refusal to concede. This hearing for him was about defending those policies and, by extension, his political identity. Facing him was Crockett, 42, a freshman congresswoman, but already recognized for her sharp questioning skills. Her background as a civil rights attorney and public defender had prepared her for moments exactly like this, confronting witnesses who thrived on aggression. Her district, encompassing parts of Dallas and its suburbs, bore the real consequences of Miller's policies, with families directly affected by detentions and separations. For Crockett, this was not just another political debate. It was about giving voice to those whose pain she had seen firsthand. The committee's investigation was focused on the lasting impact of Trump-era immigration policies, particularly family separations. Recently uncovered documents revealed that officials had been aware of the psychological harm these actions would cause but moved forward regardless. Miller, summoned to testify, came armed with data, talking points, and the same confrontational style that had once rattled senators and TV hosts alike. He interrupted Crockett 6 times in quick succession, each time raising the tension in the room. But when she finally delivered her 7th statement, firm, measured, and impossible to dismiss, Miller fell silent. That silence spoke louder than any argument. Within minutes, clips of the exchange spread across social media, racking up millions of views. Commentators framed it as more than just a heated hearing. It became a broader conversation about respect, power, and who gets to control the political narrative in America. Crockett's stance was not only professional but deeply personal. She had visited detention facilities, spoken with parents whose children had been taken, and held infants who were separated from their families. And as a black woman in Congress, she knew too well the dynamics of being interrupted, spoken over, or dismissed by powerful men who assumed dominance gave them the last word. That day, she showed the nation what it looked like to push back, with composure, facts, and conviction. The stakes of the hearing stretched far beyond one room on Capitol Hill. They touched on the legacy of a presidency, the trauma endured by thousands of families, and the ongoing debate about the soul of U.S. immigration policy. Miller wanted to prove that strict enforcement was essential to national security. Crockett wanted to ensure that the human cost was neither ignored nor forgotten. And so, the question lingers. In moments where power collides with principle, whose voice should carry further? The architect of policies, or the representative of those who lived through their consequences? Do you acknowledge that family separation caused lasting psychological harm to thousands of children? With that single question, Representative Jasmine Crockett cut through the noise of the House Judiciary Committee hearing. The room went silent for a brief moment. Everyone knew this was the confrontation they had been waiting for. The chamber was thick with tension. Behind Stephen Miller sat a row of advisors and lawyers in identical dark suits, their faces set in stone. Across the room, supporters of immigrant families filled the gallery. Some wore t-shirts with photos of children who had been torn from their parents at the border, a visible reminder of the human cost behind the policies under scrutiny. Cameras from CNN and every major network rolled live, broadcasting the drama into households across the country. Committee Chairman Jim Jordan had opened the hearing sharply at 2 p.m., but his gavel was already being tested. Republicans prepared to defend Miller, eager to steer the conversation toward current border challenges. Democrats, on the other hand, wanted answers, particularly about the administration's decision to separate children from their parents, despite internal warnings of psychological harm. Still, even among all the questioning, one clash loomed larger than the rest: Miller versus Crockett. For 20 minutes, Miller had sparred with other members, easily deflecting criticism. He leaned on his trademark tactics, talking fast, drowning out opponents, and steering every question back to his rehearsed talking points. Republican allies tossed him easy questions, giving him room to frame himself as a patriot, fighting to secure America's borders. Democrats pressed harder, but he sidestepped each attempt, pivoting the conversation back to his chosen narrative. Then came the moment. Jordan's voice cut through the noise. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes. The audience hushed. Crockett leaned forward, her tone calm yet unyielding. Mr. Miller, thank you for being here today. I'd like to begin with a simple question. Do you acknowledge that the family separation policy resulted in documented trauma for thousands of children? Miller's response was immediate, rapid, and defiant. Congresswoman, what I acknowledge is that this policy was about border security. First interruption. Crockett tried again. Mr. Miller. But he bulldozed forward, raising his voice. The real trauma is caused by human traffickers who exploit children and by past administrations that incentivized illegal crossings. Second interruption. She raised her voice slightly, still composed. Mr. Miller, I am asking a specific question about documented trauma. Miller leaned into the microphone, his tone sharp. The so-called documentation comes from biased sources that ignore the broader context of border security. Crockett didn't flinch. She met his intensity with firmness. This is my time, and I would appreciate it if you allowed me to finish. The gallery stirred with murmurs. Chairman Jordan tapped his gavel lightly, more gesture than enforcement. The witness will allow the member to ask her questions, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Miller leaned back, jaw tight, eyes locked on Crockett. She shuffled her papers deliberately, signaling that his interruptions were nothing more than background noise. Mr. Miller, she continued, holding up a document, I have here a memo from your own Department of Health and Human Services. It states, and I quote, family separation would cause significant and long-lasting psychological damage to children. This is your administration's own assessment. Do you dispute this? Instead of answering directly, Miller launched another barrage. What I dispute is the false narrative that we didn't care about children. The fact is, Crockett began to counter. The memo clearly states, but Miller pressed on, ignoring her words. The Obama administration built the cages. They were the ones who separated families first. The confrontation was now undeniable. Crockett's steady composure clashed against Miller's forceful deflections, and every camera in the room was locked on them. The stakes were no longer abstract policy debates. They were about truth, accountability, and whose voice would break through. The room was buzzing with unease. Even some Republican members, usually quick to rally behind Stephen Miller, looked uncomfortable as his interruptions grew louder and more combative. Democratic members shook their heads in disbelief. But amid the rising tension, Representative Jasmine Crockett remained steady. She jotted notes calmly on her legal pad, letting Miller's voice fill the chamber without so much as a flicker of frustration on her face. When he finally stopped to breathe, Crockett pounced. Mr. Miller, I understand you have talking points you want to push, but I'm asking about specific documents from your own administration. Fifth interruption. Miller nearly shouted into the microphone, his face flushed. My administration? My administration saved lives. My administration stopped child trafficking that you and others conveniently ignore. Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to Chairman Jim Jordan. Her voice was even, almost patient. Mr. Chairman, I ask that the witness be instructed to allow me to use my time to ask questions. Jordan, visibly weary of the escalating clash, tapped his gavel half-heartedly. Mr. Miller, please allow the Congresswoman to continue. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every angle. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, live tweeting the blow-by-blow. The atmosphere was electric. Everyone in that room knew they were watching a pivotal moment unfold. Crockett locked eyes with Miller and began again. Mr. Miller, I have been a civil rights attorney. I have been a public defender. I have stood in courtrooms across this country, and I have never... Sixth interruption. Miller couldn't resist. He leaned forward, his tone laced with condescension. Your experience in courtrooms doesn't give you expertise in national security and border enforcement, Congresswoman. The reality is... And then something changed. Crockett didn't fight to regain the floor. She didn't appeal to the chairman. Instead, she folded her arms and leaned back in her chair. For 30 full seconds, she let Miller go on unchecked, ranting about border security, trafficking, and failed democratic policies. His voice dominated the chamber, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of resistance. When Miller finally wound down, clearly expecting her to jump back in, Crockett did something more powerful. She stayed silent. 1 second, 2. The quiet stretched until it became almost unbearable. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. All eyes turned to her. Then, in a voice low but carrying to every corner of the room, she broke the silence. Mr. Miller, you have now interrupted me 6 times. 6 times you have shown this committee, the American people, and everyone in this room exactly who you are. Miller started to speak again, but Crockett raised a single finger. The gesture was small, almost delicate, but it stopped him cold. You see, she continued, her voice steady but gathering force. Men like you have been interrupting women like me our entire lives. You interrupt because you believe your voice matters more. You interrupt because you mistake volume for truth. You interrupt because, deep down, you know that if you had to actually answer my questions, if you had to confront the documented evidence of the trauma inflicted on thousands of children, your entire narrative would collapse like a house of cards in a storm. The silence that followed was absolute. Miller's face drained from red to pale. His lawyer sat frozen behind him, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment pass. Crockett, meanwhile, didn't waste the silence. She methodically laid out document after document on the desk in front of her. Reports, memos, official assessments, all reinforcing the very evidence Miller had tried to shout down. Let me tell you what these documents actually say, Mr. Miller, she said, her tone sharp but composed. Since you seem unwilling to let me ask you about them directly. In that instant, the balance of power in the hearing shifted. 8 months old, Mr. Miller. Representative Jasmine Crockett's voice was calm, but each word cut sharper than a blade. She held up a memo from the Department of Health and Human Services. This document, from your own deputy secretary, confirms that children as young as 8 months were separated from their mothers. Infants, Mr. Miller. She laid down another sheet. This report from Customs and Border Protection shows there was no system in place to reunite families. None. Then came the final blow. She raised an email chain with his name on it. And here, Mr. Miller, you dismiss concerns about the psychological impact because, and I quote, the deterrent effect outweighs other considerations. She stopped, looked up, repeated the phrase in a voice so low it seemed to echo through the chamber. Other considerations. Those were children, babies, toddlers, kids who will carry this trauma for the rest of their lives. And you knew it, you all knew it, and you did it anyway. The gallery erupted. Some gasped, others wept. and still more nodded in fierce agreement. Chairman Jim Jordan banged his gavel in vain, trying to restore order, but Crockett wasn't done. She leaned forward, her tone rising with unmistakable force. "You can interrupt me all you want. You can talk over me, dismiss me, try to diminish me, but I am still here. Those children are still traumatized. Those families remain broken. And you, Mr. Miller, you are still guilty." Then came the line that would dominate headlines and light up social media feeds. "You may have had the power to separate families, Mr. Miller, but you cannot separate yourself from the consequences of your cruelty. History has already judged you. Your legacy isn't strength. It's the sound of children crying for their parents, and no interruptions can ever silence that." The hearing room exploded. Miller's face turned ashen, his jaw opening and closing, as if searching for words that refused to come. For the first time in his career, the man who thrived on confrontation, who prided himself on never losing ground, was utterly speechless. His lawyers whispered urgently, but he didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on Crockett, wide with a mixture of disbelief and something uncomfortably close to fear. The gallery stood and applauded, some cheering, others simply clapping slowly and deliberately. Cameras zoomed in on Miller's stunned silence. Even a few Republican members looked shaken, shifting uneasily in their seats. Through it all, Crockett sat motionless, hands folded neatly before her, her expression calm as if the storm around her no longer mattered. She had taken only 3 minutes of her allotted 5, but she had said everything that needed saying. When the room finally quieted, Jordan asked, his voice thin, "Mr. Miller, would you like to respond?" Miller leaned into the microphone. The words that came were hoarse, halting. I stand by the policies of the Trump administration. We were protecting America." It was weak. Everyone knew it. Miller knew it. The man who had built his identity on strength and control had been undone by a freshman congresswoman from Texas. Crockett's closing was devastating in its simplicity. "Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time." Mr. Miller's silence speaks louder than any words he could offer. And then something extraordinary happened. Members of the gallery began to stand again, not with wild applause, but with slow, deliberate clapping that spread across the chamber like a wave. It was not a celebration, it was a verdict. Stephen Miller sat motionless at the witness table, his once carefully prepared notes scattered before him like meaningless scraps. His advisors and lawyers, usually confident and composed, looked just as shaken. They had gamed out every possible attack on Miller's record, every question that might be thrown his way. What they had not prepared for was this: Jasmine Crockett turning Miller's own tactics against him, transforming his interruptions into evidence of his character, and delivering a devastating statement that left no ground for rebuttal. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Miller's hands trembled as he reached for a water glass, nearly knocking it over. The man who had once stood at White House podiums and defended policies many considered indefensible now looked as if he wanted nothing more than to disappear from sight. Representative Ted Lieu leaned toward his microphone. "Mr. Chairman, I think Congresswoman Crockett has said everything that needs to be said. I yield my time." One by one, Democratic members followed suit. It was unprecedented. They gave up their chance to confront one of the most controversial figures of the Trump administration, recognizing that nothing they could say would surpass the blow Crockett had just delivered. Each act of yielding became another quiet reminder that Miller had already lost. By the time Chairman Jim Jordan called a recess, Miller resembled a battered fighter still standing only because he hadn't yet learned how to fall. He remained seated as the room cleared, staring blankly at the table, ignoring the murmured encouragement of his team. In just 3 minutes, Crockett had done what years of protests, editorials, and political attacks had failed to do. She pierced the armor Miller had built around himself and revealed the raw cruelty behind his policies. Meanwhile, the outside world was already reacting. The clip raced across social media with astonishing speed. Within an hour, Crockett destroys Miller was trending globally. The now famous line, "Your legacy isn't strength, Mr. Miller. It's the sound of children crying for their parents," was replayed, remixed, and even turned into protest signs. Television networks interrupted regular programming to show the exchange in full. On CNN, Anderson Cooper led with the story, airing all 3 minutes without interruption. In 20 years of covering politics, he told viewers afterward, I have never seen anything quite like this. Over on Fox News, even typically loyal commentators struggled to spin the moment. Tucker Carlson admitted, Miller walked into a trap today. He should have let her ask her questions. Laura Ingraham tried to redirect the conversation toward current border debates, but guests kept dragging the focus back to the viral exchange. On MSNBC, Joy Reid was blunt. This is what happens when you try to bulldoze a black woman who came prepared with receipts. Jasmine Crockett didn't just silence Stephen Miller today. She exposed the weakness of bullies who mistake interruption for intelligence. The political world moved quickly. Former President Barack Obama weighed in with a tweet. Representative Jasmine Crockett showed us all what grace under pressure looks like today. For Miller, it was a humiliating collapse. For Crockett, it was a career-defining moment. And for the millions who watched, it was more than just political theater. It was a reckoning over respect, accountability, and who gets to control the story in American politics. More than a dramatic exchange, the hearing underscored something deeper. The voices of those harmed by harsh policies will not be silenced. From the White House came an unusually direct statement. President Biden, through his press office, acknowledged the emotional and political weight of the moment. Today's hearing highlighted the deep wounds left by the previous administration's family separation policy. Representative Crockett's powerful words remind us why we must never again allow such cruelty to be inflicted in America's name. Predictably, Donald Trump rushed to Miller's defense. On Truth Social, he wrote, Stephen Miller was ambushed by a radical left Democrat who doesn't understand border security. He was fighting for America while she grandstanded for cameras. Witch hunt continues. Yet, even to supporters, the post felt half-hearted, lacking Trump's usual fiery energy. Perhaps more telling was the silence from many Republicans who typically leapt to Miller's side. Senator Ted Cruz, normally quick to attack Democrats, offered only, I didn't watch the hearing. I was focused on border security legislation. Senator Marco Rubio, pressed by reporters, sidestepped with a call to lower the temperature and focus on solutions. The absence of a strong defense spoke volumes. Meanwhile, the political tides were shifting rapidly. Crockett's office was inundated with calls, emails, and messages of support. Her social media following surged, 500,000 new followers in a single day. Major networks clamored for interviews, but she declined most, choosing instead a thoughtful conversation with PBS NewsHour. This isn't about me versus Stephen Miller, she told anchor Amna Nawaz. This is about accountability for policies that harmed thousands of children. Mr. Miller wanted to make it about interruptions, about dominance. But the American people deserve better than theater. They deserve the truth. And the truth is, these policies were cruel, deliberately cruel, and those who crafted them must take responsibility. On the other side, Miller's team scrambled into damage control. They released a statement accusing Crockett of ambushing him and playing politics with national security. But the words rang hollow. Miller himself, uncharacteristically subdued, canceled a planned Fox News appearance with Sean Hannity, fueling speculation about the depth of the blow to his reputation. Behind the scenes, frustrations bubbled even within Republican ranks. One GOP member of the Judiciary Committee told Politico anonymously, "He made us all look bad. You can't just interrupt your way through oversight hearings. Crockett played him like a violin, and he walked right into it." For immigration advocates, the hearing was more than political spectacle. It was a rallying cry. Crockett's now iconic line about Miller's legacy appeared on T-shirts, protest signs, and hashtags that trended for days. Families directly impacted by separations began speaking out again, empowered by seeing someone in Congress publicly confront the man most associated with their pain. Legal experts quickly weighed in as well. The documents Crockett cited, many of which had received little attention before, revealed that officials knew the harm separations would cause but pressed forward anyway. Constitutional law scholar Lawrence Tribe praised Crockett's precision. What Representative Crockett did was brilliant from a legal perspective. She didn't just embarrass Miller personally. She entered key evidence into the congressional record and forced him, through silence, to implicitly acknowledge its accuracy. That will matter in court. The cultural impact was no less profound. What began as a heated exchange inside a crowded committee chamber had become a turning point in the national conversation about power, accountability, and the cost of cruelty in policymaking. A year later, the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Stephen Miller was still reverberating through American politics. It had become more than a viral clip. It was a cultural landmark. The confrontation was featured in an award-winning documentary on U.S. immigration policy, with Crockett and affected families giving emotional interviews. Miller declined to participate. The film reignited attention to the trauma experienced by separated families, ensuring the human cost of policy decisions stayed in public view. In classrooms across the country, political science professors dissected the hearing. Dr. Jennifer Lawless of the University of Virginia called it a perfect example of how preparation, composure, and moral clarity can overcome aggression and interruption. Crockett didn't try to outshout Miller. She turned his behavior into the very evidence against him. The ripple effects went far beyond academia. In subsequent congressional hearings, witnesses who attempted Miller-style filibustering were swiftly shut down. Committee chairs began using a new shorthand. "We're not doing Miller interruptions here." The phrase caught on. Outside of Washington, women in law, business, and academia began sharing their own Crockett moments. Instances when they had transformed disrespect or interruptions into opportunities to demonstrate strength. The term "pulling a Crockett" entered the political lexicon, meaning to disarm aggression with calm precision. For Miller, the fallout was enduring. Though he retained a loyal core of supporters, his standing in mainstream conservative politics diminished. Once a key voice shaping national policy from the White House, he was relegated to fringe podcasts and small gatherings. The shadow of that hearing never left him. He was permanently marked as the man who had been rendered speechless by a freshman congresswoman he tried to talk over. Meanwhile, the legal consequences unfolded. Families suing the government over separations began citing Crockett's presentation of internal documents as evidence. In one landmark case, a federal judge explicitly referenced the hearing, writing, "As Representative Crockett powerfully demonstrated, the cruelty was not incidental. It was intentional." The ruling granted damages to families, embedding her words into the legal record. 2 years after the hearing, Crockett published Uninterrupted: Speaking Truth to Power in America. The book became a bestseller, with the chapter on Miller widely quoted. In it, she reflected on the moment that defined her career. "That moment wasn't planned. I had questions, I had documents, but when Stephen Miller interrupted me for the 6th time, something crystallized. His interruptions weren't just disrespectful to me. They symbolized how his policies had interrupted the lives of thousands of families. Children interrupted from their childhoods. Parents interrupted from their roles as protectors. Communities interrupted by fear and trauma. When I spoke, I wasn't speaking just for myself. I was speaking for every child who cried themselves to sleep in a detention center, for every parent whose baby was pulled from their arms, for every person told their voice didn't matter." Stephen Miller thought he could silence me with interruptions. Instead, those interruptions became proof of his guilt, not only in that hearing room, but in the broader court of history. Because here's what men like Miller never understand. You can interrupt our words, but you cannot interrupt our truth. You can talk over us, but you cannot silence the moral weight of justice. You can try to dominate the conversation, but you cannot escape the reckoning that always comes for those who choose cruelty over compassion. The moment that began as a clash in a crowded hearing room had become a touchstone in American political life, remembered not only for its drama, but for its enduring lesson. Silence, used at the right time, can be more powerful than any outburst. The release of Uninterrupted and its book tour reignited public debate about immigration and propelled Representative Jasmine Crockett further into the national spotlight. Commentators began to speculate about her political future. Was a Senate run next? Was she being groomed for leadership at the national level? Crockett dismissed the chatter with characteristic bluntness. I'm focused on doing the job the people of Texas sent me to do. If I do that well, the future will take care of itself. But beyond her personal trajectory, the Crockett-Miller confrontation had left a lasting mark on American political life. The exchange became shorthand for a new kind of accountability, one that didn't rely on shouting matches or one-upmanship, but instead used calm, documented facts and moral clarity to dismantle bullying tactics. Political consultants on both sides of the aisle began studying the moment. The old playbook of interrupting and dominating doesn't work when your opponent knows how to turn it against you, one Republican strategist admitted. Crockett showed us that preparation and composure beat bluster every time. In journalism schools, professors cited the hearing as an example of how political theater can transcend spectacle. Crockett didn't just create a viral clip, explained Columbia journalism professor Emily Bell. She turned Miller's behavior into a window on the cruelty of his policies. That's sophisticated communication, powerful enough to cross party lines. Perhaps the deepest impact was psychological. For families who had lived through separations, the moment carried healing power. Maria Santos, whose 3-year-old son was taken from her for 8 months, described the significance. For so long, it felt like nobody in power cared about our pain. Seeing Miller held accountable, seeing him unable to answer, it gave me hope. It made me feel like someone was finally fighting for us. Support groups began showing clips of the hearing as part of therapy sessions. Psychologists reported that seeing Miller confronted in such a public way helped children and parents begin to process their trauma. It's not justice in the legal sense, explained Dr. Luis Sass, who had evaluated separated children. But when someone in power names the cruelty for what it was, that acknowledgement itself has therapeutic value. 3 years on, the legacy of that hearing was everywhere. Crockett's words, "Your legacy isn't strength, it's the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from," had become one of the most quoted lines in modern politics. The phrase appeared in academic papers, engraved on monuments honoring migrant families, and cited by politicians across the spectrum as they sought to distance themselves from family separation. Crockett herself rose in prominence but remained grounded in legislative work. She successfully advanced bills on immigration reform and child welfare, always pointing back to the families she had fought for. "Every bill I write, every speech I give, I think about those children," she said in an interview marking the hearing's 3rd anniversary. They deserved better than what America gave them. We all do. Stephen Miller, by contrast, slipped further into obscurity. His efforts to rehabilitate his image through op-eds and sympathetic interviews failed to resonate. The defining image of him, pale and speechless at the witness table, haunted every attempt at a comeback. Political obituaries of his career invariably mentioned the Crockett exchange as the moment his influence effectively ended. The broader lesson for American democracy was undeniable. Preparation, truth, and moral clarity could still triumph over aggression, interruption, and cruelty. In an era often defined by spectacle and empty performance, Crockett demonstrated that substance mattered, that accountability was possible, and that speaking truth to power with calm determination could still change the course of history. The story of how Representative Jasmine Crockett transformed Stephen Miller's 6 interruptions into his undoing has become more than a viral clip. It has evolved into a case study in accountability, how to confront bullies, defend truth, and give voice to those who had long been silenced. What made Crockett's performance so striking wasn't only her words, though they were devastating. It was her composure, her refusal to be shaken, and her ability to flip Miller's aggression into proof of his own moral weakness. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to out-interrupt him. Instead, she allowed his behavior to reveal his character, then connected that personal disrespect to the broader cruelty of the policies he had defended. Her 7 statements now read like milestones in a masterclass. Her first question about documented trauma. Her insistence on citing specific memos. Her demand for basic respect of her time. Her citation of internal HHS documents. Her invocation of her experience as a civil rights attorney. Her deliberate silence after his 6th interruption. And finally, the line that would end his influence. Your legacy isn't strength, Mr. Miller. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from. For anyone facing their own Stephen Miller, a figure who mistakes volume for authority, who interrupts to dominate, who believes their voice matters more, Crockett's example offers a blueprint. Don't meet aggression with more aggression, don't play the same game. Instead, stay calm, stay prepared, and let truth speak louder than bluster. The impact of that hearing continues to ripple far beyond Washington. Young women in law, politics, and business study it as a guide to handling disrespect. Lawyers use it as a teaching tool in witness examinations. Political scientists analyze it as proof that congressional oversight can still matter when pursued with precision and clarity. And most importantly, separated families, those directly harmed, felt that at last someone had said aloud what they had been carrying in silence. What was done to them was cruel, it was deliberate, and it was wrong. Crockett didn't just win a political exchange. She restored dignity to the dehumanized, gave voice to the unheard, and offered hope to those who had nearly given up on being remembered. In an age where theater often overshadows substance and where loudness can drown out truth, her triumph over Miller serves as a reminder. Preparation, composure, and moral clarity still matter. Bullies, no matter how powerful, cannot forever escape accountability. In the end, their interruptions are always interrupted by the truth, and when that moment comes, no amount of shouting can prevent their collapse in the face of justice. As we continue reckoning with the legacy of family separation and striving toward a more humane immigration system, the lesson from that day in the Judiciary Committee remains clear. Truth is patient, but it cannot be silenced. We value every comment you share. Your engagement helps us keep bringing thoughtful analysis to those who care about truth, justice, and accountability in American politics. In the end, Crockett's confrontation with Stephen Miller wasn't just about one hearing. It was about reminding us all that in the fight for justice, every voice matters. The question is, will we use our voices with the same clarity, courage, and determination that she did on that unforgettable day? The responsibility and the opportunity is ours. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most powerful political moments of recent years. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, no one can interrupt the truth when it's spoken with conviction. We'll see you in the next video where we continue exploring the moments that shape American democracy.